So just to start off on where TrustedSec is, again, we know us for pen testing and program assessments and PCI compliance, but a couple of services that might be helpful if you're looking at getting started with a SIM for the first time, or you're looking to improve it. Check out our MITRE ATT&CK and Blue Team engagements. We've seen a lot of interest in those within CMMC as people are getting started. Some of the DoD contractors, you might have IoT or hardware devices that you make that you might want to look into testing them for security. And of course, we provide CMMC readiness, which of course is taken off right now. And again, thank you for joining. And within that, also we have hardening and configuration baselines. And lastly, tabletop exercises can't get, because you really do get engagement from those people. So with that, I want to introduce ourselves. Alex, start us off.
So hello everybody, my name is Alex Hamerstone. I work on the advisory team here at TrustedSec. I work with all different types of clients and all different types of verticals on multiple types of assessments. Been in the industry a while now, and have been lucky enough to work with 800-171 prior to the CMMC, and also to be able to start with an organization about the CMMC, and really looking forward to having this conversation today.
Rick.
Hey everybody, I'm Rick Yocum. I've been doing security and compliance stuff for probably longer than I'd like to admit now. Bounced between the consulting side and actually helping to run programs at organizations of various sizes, and I've had the distinct pleasure of setting up a couple 171 shops in my past as well. So excited to talk about the CMMC stuff as well.
Thanks, Rick. And my name is Stephen Marshowitz. I'm the Director of Program Development here at TrustedSec. Been in security for a long time now. Done a lot of program development, digital transformation, as well as aligning security with the business. So we want to start off with, and again, if you haven't seen the previous webinar on cyber maturity model certification, definitely check that out. It has some things in there with the terms, etc. But over the year, we've run into things that continually come up from that webinar, and we still just wanted to touch base on them. So the first question that we still get a lot of, and still is a good reason for getting that question, is what actually does constitute CUI?
Man, there are layers to this answer. But the shortest answer is, that link on the page right there will bring you to the National Archives and Record Administration website, and it'll have sort of an index of CUI, which is controlled unclassified information. So stuff that's not so secret that it needs to be technically classified, but it's still so sensitive that the government wants some layer of cybersecurity control over it. That archives.gov site is a great place to get started in terms of understanding what's in there and what's not in there. But part of the CUI was kind of developed as part of the concept of it was, really came about as part of defining NIST 800-171 and the protections around it. And because NIST 800-171 has been around for a while, the concept of CUI has as well. But when NIST 800-171 came about, there were a lot of prime contractors that would, just say, hey, we're not gonna really do a ton of homework in terms of figuring out which of our contracts have CUI and which of them don't. Just as a matter of principle, make sure that everything you do on behalf of us, if you're a subcontractor, make sure you do everything on behalf of us, you treat it like CUI. And it complicates things for some organizations because whether or not you actually have CUI, right, specific type of data from the government that you need to protect a certain way, you might actually have to adhere to existing contracts with your prime contractors, even if you don't have that CUI. So the technical definition of CUI as the government sees it is at that archives.gov, but you just want to make sure you remember that regardless of what those definitions say, you might have a contractual obligation to treat everything associated with a certain prime contract as CUI, even if it isn't really.
So will they have to take direction from the DoD on that, those prime contractors, when it gets pushed down?
So ultimately, yes and no, right? They have to take direction from prime contractors regardless, because they own the contract. But the way it works for actual CUI when CMMC really goes into effect is the CUI that requires additional protection is going to be defined in the contract with the prime contractor, and they're going to have to flow that down to all their subcontractors. So if you're a subcontractor that hasn't seen that yet, you almost certainly will, but most subcontractors are kind of used to that process already, again, because at least some of the stuff that happened in the NIST 800-171 days.
Okay, great. So Alex, walk us through process maturity versus control maturity.
So, it's really interesting that, maturity is right in the name, the CMMC. And it's something that, we talk about a lot, just in general in security is, kind of existence versus effectiveness and what those things mean. And, for a lot of what we've looked at in the past, they really are looking more at the existence and not as much as at the effectiveness. And if you look at really these two pillars throughout the level, 1 through 5, and they broke them out into processes and practices. And you have to think about it as practices are kind of the things you have to do, controls that have to be in place, things that you can look at and kind of see them, such as you can see things like that. And the processes are really around how are you doing them? And when you take the term maturity, it's really combining those things and thinking about the formality and the optimization of those processes, and making sure that they're formally defined. So things that you don't just have it in place, but you have the means in place to measure them, assess them. It's not just building a wall, it's also looking at that wall to make sure it's still going to be effective for new threats or things that change or whatever else may come. We've talked about this a lot, from the start of, when CMMC was just kind of a glimmer in the government's eye, is that it's going to be really a sea change for a lot of organizations that are used to, first off, self-assessment, and now it's becoming a third-party audit. But also that the goal is, we'll see how it really ends up in practice, but the goal is really to make sure that, these controls are actually mature and that they're not just, in place. So it's really gonna be interesting, if you look through the different levels, there's kind of a different in terms of not just what's in place, but the evidence and how it's in place as well.
So breaking it down, Rick, what does that mean just overall or from a high level? What do you have to do for each level?
Yeah, so it's important to remember too that each level builds on the prior level. And 1 is sort of the least mature in the scale and 5 is the most mature in the scale. So if you're doing 3, that assumes you're doing all the stuff in 1 plus all the stuff in 2 plus all the stuff you have to do for 3. But basically, as far as what maturity looks like at a high level, in addition to those, controls at each level, for level 1, there's really no specific documentation or things that you have to have. But when you get into level 2, you're really looking at having to have developed, documented policies and procedures that you follow. Level 3, you're really getting into more of a specific control index, right? That talks about ownership, frequency, procedures, all that kind of stuff. All the stuff that, the details that typically go into sort of SSPs and things like that. When you get into level 4, now you have to not only have all the, how you do the controls documented, but you also have to document, who's responsible for the oversight and how frequently does that oversight happen and what happens if something goes wrong with the control, right? All that health stuff, to make sure the environment stays healthy. And level 5 actually doesn't add anything to the first 4 levels that's brand new, but what it does do is it says, hey, if you have 5 different divisions, or if you have you sell to the government in 3 or 4 different ways, right? You need to align those processes and practices and controls sort of as much as possible. So level 5 is really standardizing. Oftentimes it also entails some level of centralization, but standardization is the real key here. And it's also worth knowing that these levels are tied to the actual type of data that you have. So level 1's required for FCI, federal contract information. So if you do business with the government, directly or as a sub, and you have access to that information, then you're going to be in scope. They think that the vast majority of contractors in the defense industrial base are going to be level 1. Level 2 is really kind of a milestone in terms of getting to demonstrate progress towards level 3, but there's no data actually associated with it. Level 3 is really where CUI, if you have CUI, what you need to do in order to protect it. And level 4 and level 5 are also CUI. They're going to be subsets of slightly more sensitive CUI, and it's my understanding they're still kind of figuring out the details behind those assessments or those levels.
Okay, great. We had a question. Can you point to any documentation on creating an operational control index?
Can I point to documentation? I mean, honestly, if you were to look at sort of like the CMMC stuff, like the core components of or CMMC, the SSP, the core components of an SSP will provide a lot of this information. But at the heart of it, what that really, and we're going to get there in a minute. But at the heart of it, what we mean when we talk about an operational control index is really just sort of a listing of the who, what, when, where, how, in terms of each control, right? So who's responsible for performing it? Where do they perform it in terms of scope? And what's the frequency? At a minimum, it's that, because what we find frequently with a lot of organizations is they might have great policy documentation and it might have sort of all the stuff, but if it's not sort of an operational thing that lives and breathes a little bit, people rarely double back if they miss a date or slip on a date or something like that. So it's really just making sure there's a living, breathing index of how you're executing those controls. But in terms of sort of what an SSP looks like, and which they talk about, it's really the stuff here, right? So who's the system owner, who's the authorizing official, designated contacts, all these good things. But if I pull it up a level, SSPs are really a way to collect a bunch of different technologies and processes and to put together kind of an operational document to say, here's how we protect that grouping of things, right? Even though it's called a system security plan, it's pretty typical for it to involve multiple components or multiple what we think of as systems from a technologist. So it'll have servers and network devices and things like that. They can be segmented and separated and treated separately, but more often than not, there's a specific function that a grouping of technologies perform, and that grouping of technologies will be covered in a system security plan.
Yeah, and just to piggyback on that or help get more clarification. So what is a system? And I know you kind of talked about it, but just maybe be crystal clear on that, because that is one of the questions we get a lot of. We just had another question come in. Does it make sense to create multiple SSPs? Does one of them map directly to authorization or to operate? So multiple boundaries, et cetera.
Yeah, so typically, if you're working in the government space, I mean, if you're in the government and you need to get ATO's authorization to operate, that's going to be done on an SSP by SSP level, right? So to answer your first question first, Steve, what is a system? It's really just going to be a grouping of technologies and processes designed to perform a function. You can define that in a bunch of different ways. You could say, hey, our company, these specific, we make widgets for the government, and here's the systems that we need to make widgets. We need a shared drive, so that's on a server. There's some network devices, and there's a CAD machine that looks at drawing documents and builds stuff. Those things might be collected as a system because they perform a function of helping to build the thing. But you could also slice it a completely different way. You could say all of our servers, we manage them the same way, so we're going to call that a system and build a SSP around that. There are multiple ways to slice it, but in terms of figuring out the easiest way, especially if you don't need to have ATOs, for instance, the thing to keep in mind is your approvals of some sort or your certifications will be built around SSPs. So typically it makes sense to group SSPs around a business function. I see someone in the chat note that, you know, sometimes you can build it around cage codes. So for those that are familiar with cage codes, that's absolutely typically a way you do it, because it's a grouping of systems designated to perform a function, and it'll pass or fail as a group of systems holistically. In terms of creating multiple SSPs or having a single SSP, the key thing to keep in mind is it's typically slightly more administrative work to maintain multiple SSPs. But again, you're managing multiple things, but if one of those SSPs has an issue, it doesn't necessarily indicate an issue with all the other SSPs. So you can kind of manage them administratively separately. So every organization is going to be a little bit different in terms of how they're managed, and whether multiple SSPs is the way to go or one SSP is the way to go. But it's kind of just depends on whether you want to err on the side of, you know, doing more oversight documentation type work, or whether you want to, you know, take on a bit of additional risk by having it all under one blanket SSP, so that if something goes wrong, it indicates an issue with the whole enchilada.
Excellent.
I think I covered most of that stuff, but what else, Steve? What did I miss? Oh, maybe you're on mute, Steve.
This was one last slide. What's,
Yep.
Are you there? Able to hear me? Able to hear me now? Okay, great. Sorry, so we're having a little internet connection troubles. Remote handling of CUI. Again, we touched on this in the last one, but with COVID and everything, this comes up again as well. So just seems like sort of common sense-ish things, but anything in particular that people should be concerned about or looking into?
Yeah, the real key is, you know, it's so easy for folks to, you know, utilize what I think of as I'm air quoting, an unmanaged home system when they're working from home. And as soon as that happens, you know, now you have this sort of regulated data on a device that's, you know, unmanaged more or less. And you know, you just need to make sure you're doing everything you can in terms of education and technical controls and things like that to prevent that from happening. You know, the bullets in here, you know, to your point, they seem obvious, but they're so easy for someone who's trying to do the right thing for the business to do the wrong thing from a regulatory perspective in this case. So making sure they know it can't be on their personal systems, you know, printing is a minimum, you know, that's great. You know, virtual desktops and things like that, right? If, you know, ideally they're connecting in, as opposed to storing that stuff on a home laptop, you know, that's a typical solution we see for stuff like that. And email is really a big one that we see a lot, because emails, you know, it's just so easy to forward them around, or, you know, if you're going to be unable to check your work account, or you just prefer to check your home account, and, you know, you set up a forwarding rule or something, you know, those are all no-nos in terms of CUI stuff, because, you know, that's really what'll sort of breach the system boundaries really, really easily. So a lot of it's training, a lot of it's administrative. Certainly there are DLP type things that you know, you can do here, but CUI is such a broad swath of different types of data. It's typically, you know, better to make sure that people understand kind of the approved ways of working, and periodically check in to make sure they're sticking to them.
Okay, great. Thank you. All right, so let's get into some of the other lessons from the trenches. And this next one's a big one. Comes up a lot. What is in scope? How do you define it? What types of things do you have to do? Alice, you want to take a stab at that?
Well, I think even before getting into it, you know, what constituted it, this is really one of the most important things. You know, as a consultant, it probably sounds corny, but, you know, one of our favorite things is to be able to kind of save people money and effort. And, you know, we walked into environments where the scope was just way too large, or with certain business processes, they were able to really get the scope down. You know, you always say, a bank doesn't build a vault around the whole building, they built it around the money. And so by putting all the money in one spot, or, you know, making sure you know where it is, it really can be much more efficient, so that you make sure you really before just kind of jumping in, data is in places that you know where it is, and you can make sure that the controls are addressing those things directly.
So Rick, what is then the boundary for an SSP, or what is the boundary for CMMC?
So the boundary for CMMC is really, you know, all the things, and it says it up top, you know, that process, store, or transmit CUI. So if you're accessing it, if it's storing it, if it's being sent over a wire, right? That's really the scope. In addition to that, you know, other in-scope things or partially in-scope things are going to include the components that provide security protection for the systems that have CUI on them, right? So if you're in a Windows shop and you have CUI on a Windows server that's joined to the domain, there's going to be, at a minimum, components of that domain that are going to be in scope. The thing to keep in mind here is, scope really applies across all layers of infrastructure from a technology perspective, right? So whether it's domain, network, application, database, all that stuff, you want to make sure you have, you know, you're thinking about, you're considering, you're looking at it. And in an unsegmented environment, sort of like the one depicted here, right, you can see there's a couple systems in green that have like tiny little bubbles around them because they might not have any CUI or FCI and not be used to access it. But all this other stuff is in scope because in an unsegmented environment, right? So you don't really have network segmentation or good logical segmentation or any physical segmentation really. You know, the whole thing is going to be in scope because it becomes very difficult to prove that you could not get to CUI from a specific place. But in general, right, anything that's not sort of intentionally segmented off and CUI lives there or could live there, that's going to be your scope.
And so when you're looking at a data flow, and that's, you know, one of the things that you have to at least be able to show or understand. And if you have a data flow, it makes it easier to audit against. So what would constitute then a strong or at least a solid data flow from point to point? Would it include an environment like this where you show where the data comes in and where it hits? How specific or how broad can that be?
Well, I guess I would say the broader the data flow is, the more that the auditors or assessors are going to believe are in scope, right? So the more specific you can be, the higher your ability to limit that scope to a large extent. You know, it depends a lot on the amount of homework that you want to and that you can do. Obviously, you know, you want to have the best information possible in terms of your sources of CUI, where their point of entry is into your environment, and then where they get distributed to within your environment, and then the exit points from your environment, right? And if you can map that out, that's typically the first step. And you can do that at a high level and say, look, you know, any sales endpoint might get CUI because people get these zip files that have a bunch of specs in them and there's technical data in there, and that's all CUI. So all sales endpoints are in scope. Or maybe you have a business process that says, look, these are the only 3 salespeople that work on government stuff. They're the only ones that are going to get CUI, and, you know, specify the names of their machines specifically. So a lot of it does depend on business process, but the more specific, the more you can know very specifically what that data is, where it flows, how it comes in, where it's stored, how it leaves, the better you're going to be able to ratchet down the scope of the actual assessment.
So with that, talk to us a little bit about scope reduction, as you talked about before.
Yeah, so I mean, typically,
it doesn't always have maybe the most cost-effective ways, just in general.
Yeah, so typically, you know, the more you can kind of consolidate where the sensitive stuff lives, and this is as true for CMMC as it is for, you know, practically any, you know, data-driven regulation. But the more you can consolidate it so that you can consolidate the rules and make sure you're managing all the appropriate systems or all the applicable systems appropriately, the better off you're going to be. It's going to drive clarity around folks understanding the controls that need to be in place. And it's going to just drive additional consistency and some operational efficiencies when you're actually executing these controls. So you don't necessarily do, you can start to do things like setting a bunch of systems to work off the same access groups as opposed to each have individual ones, which then makes things like audits and operations a lot easier. Typically the ways that you do that are going to be, physical or logical separation. I mean, the logical separation is almost always going to be access related, and that access related stuff can happen at the network layer, the application layer, the database layer, wherever. And typically it happens as a combination of those things, right? So you might have some VLANs with some ACLs and network segmentation going. You're also going to have access controls at the operating system or domain layer that prevent people from logging onto machines that might have CUI. And then within that, again, you might have, application layer controls or, or password protected files or password protected, file stores that help keep that CUI safe. So it's kind of a balancing act between, between having defense in depth and doing all the things you need to do from a CMMC perspective. But typically, right, if you can layer those access controls, you're going to have a much better time in terms of proving that access is appropriately segmented and that these things are out of scope for several reasons as opposed to just one.
As we've talked, it's not fully finalized yet. They're coming out with more guidance on exactly what this means. So, we're waiting for that, but I think at this point, everything you said there is very helpful. So thank you. And then I could also ask one question, and again, another thing we talk about is the POAMs, how they come into play, the plan of actions and milestones versus how it was in 800-171 or in FedRAMP, for example.
Yeah, so the thing is, POAMs are effectively plans of action and mitigation or plans of action and milestones. Ways to fix stuff that's not exactly as it should be from a regulatory perspective. It's very commonly used in conjunction with SSPs, and they're used a lot in the NIST 800-171 world. But to get the CMMC certification, right? Once you're ready for the audit and you get the assessment done, essentially you can't have, what they keep saying is you can't have any active POAMs, right? So you have to be done, you have to be ready, you have to be able to demonstrate to an auditor that all these controls are in place. So just in case you aren't familiar with the term, that's what it is. And really, the thing to keep in mind is you can't have POAMs when it's time to go to when it's time to get audited and certified for CMMC. However, there's certainly a tool that can be used on the road to CMMC.
Exactly. Okay, great, thanks. Another thing we get, when do we have to be compliant? And this has been, big concern, especially starting last year. Alex, we thought, all right, you're going to have to be within a Q1, and then it was Q3, and just go over a little bit about where we are now and some of the guidance that they've given around that.
So the answer is it's coming. And, but the important thing to note too is we've obviously seen this timeline change a little bit and be modified and other things like that. But, for right now, what they're saying is, in this year, there'll be 15 contracts that require it. It's going to grow next year to 75, 2023 to 250. Grow more in 2024, and then in 2025, we'll start with most of them, obviously an ambiguous term, but end the year with really all of them. And then as we kind of roll into 2026, it's going to be all the contracts are going to require this. It's obviously with anything, having a long deadline is sometimes the worst thing that can happen because we feel like we have a lot of time. But, really, even though this may look pretty far out, I mean, obviously the time is now to really get yourself set up and start to think about how you're going to comply, what you're going to do, because this is coming and it's not going away. So,
yeah, and just to reiterate, because we got a question on it. Yes, when we're talking about these figures, and most of what we're talking today is about CUI and not FCI. Again, FCI is level 1, and they estimate something like 60% of all of the contractors are only going to have to meet level 1. So this, when we're talking about this and where people are really being challenged, is with level 3 compliance. So just kind of a clarification within that. And I think one other thing about this is that we still get concerned that you have to be done this year because, hey, my prime is in that 15, or my prime is in that next 75. So they're going to be pushing it down to meet anyway. So, but as it stands, the true definition of when you have to be compliant, this is the timeline that they're looking at. Again, plus or minus, and I'm sure things will change, but these are really the type of folks, or those types of contracts that are going to require it. Okay, great. All right, so tell us again a little bit about CMMC versus 800-171. Not everyone's familiar with 871. A lot of people have just kind of come up to speed with CMMC because it is so broad and affecting all 300 and some thousand folks in the defense industrial base. So what, Alex, have you seen have been the real sort of differences and the challenges that people are kind of coming to grips with?
So having worked with 800-171, for a while, I think, to put it politely, there was certainly a wide range in the veracity of assessments. A lot of with the self-assessments, and really, I don't know that in my career even I've ever really seen someone maliciously, answer something incorrectly or say they had something they didn't. A lot of times it was really a lack of understanding of what was really being asked and, what was going to really meet the requirements. Obviously with anything with contracting, people want the business. So they're, probably going to just naturally lean towards be able to say it's in place or whatever it may have been. But this is going to be a third party, audit, and it's just extremely different. If you've worked in IT audit or information security or anything like that, then you're very familiar with the difference between something that is more of a self-assessment versus something that's a true certification and an audit. And so it's going to look a lot more, like what we're used to seeing with, audits to other standards. Things like having 2 or 3 forms of evidence, the policies and procedures in place, the on-site review, right? So looking over your shoulder. So actually viewing settings, viewing configurations. Even testing and validating that the controls are in place and that they're functioning in the way that we expect. And again, anyone who's been through any kind of audit is very well aware that sometimes even when you feel like you're pretty well set up for the audit, the way the auditors operate, it can often uncover something that was unexpected or find things in certain places you weren't thinking or anything like that. But they're really, looking to see that these things are actually in place and that they're actually functioning in the way that they're expected to, that are really meeting the requirement. They're not just looking to see, do you have some tool, right? Is that tool effective? Is it doing what it's supposed to? Is it configured properly, et cetera? Additionally, kind of what we're seeing is something that's pretty interesting is only having one person in the room at the time during the audit. To kind of prevent people from being coached or anything like that. So this is kind of gives you an idea, I think, of the veracity and the seriousness of how these audits will be conducted. And then also we're going to be seeing the recertification every 3 years. So again, I don't think I can stress enough, just as someone that's been an information security consultant for longer, a pretty long time, that it's such a huge difference between a third-party audit and kind of what 800-171 was. And so anyone who I think is thinking that it's going to the CMMC, the 871 with a bit more is kind of going to be in for a pretty big surprise.
And one of the big things with that is governance. So Alex, you're big on this. What is governance?
So, obviously governance, is one of those things that, in talking to clients, it's a word that's used in many different ways by many different people, but in this case, it's really, establishing that and maintaining that you have resources, that you have a plan to cover each domain. How are you funding it? Are you funding tools? Are you funding the people. Do you have projects plans in place? Are you recording, what you're doing? Any due dates for your self-assessment and your self-audits? Do you really have the resources that are assigned to the management, the oversight of these activities? And, are you training people? Training is extremely important, and really understanding who the actual stakeholders are. So who is authorizing this program internally? How are you, making sure that you're checking constantly to make sure it's still working and providing what you need? And also, I think it's interesting. I think we all know about documentation. Not everyone loves that word, but really, can you show what you're doing? Being able to say, hey, we did it, or you should trust us on this. You've got to really be able to show your work, so having the evidence, having the paper trails, having those workflows, approvals, just the evidence that you're doing what you're supposed to is going to be essential, and just making sure that's all buttoned up really well.
Excellent, thanks. So another big one, and I know probably a lot of people have heard this before, security is not compliance, but compliance and security have overlap. But with that, there are specific examples, Rick, that we've dealt a lot with of what the goal of that control is. Does it meet it? And does CMMC specifically say that you have to do it this way, or do they do things in a broader method? So, for example, some things they want very specific and they want absolute clarity, and yet there are other things in this choices that you have and how to go about becoming compliant and secure that are a little bit more vague, or does give you an opportunity to make a trade-off versus getting a particular type of technology or tool or process versus another one. Can you expand on this a little bit and kind of tell us some of the stories or an example of where this kind of comes up?
Yeah, I'll start with an easy one and then I'll get a little more specific. But one of the very easy ones is, I think penetration testing is a level 4 control, right? So typically, to be compliant, you really don't need to evidence, penetration testing. But from a security perspective, it's one of those things that we would definitely suggest that everyone does, regardless. Anyone with any kind of sensitive data or assets do. Regardless of whether or not they're going to end up with level 4 CUI data or not. A slightly deeper example that we encounter every once in a while has to do with encryption at rest, for instance, right? So there's actually a couple clients that we've talked to recently about this, where they say, hey, for a bunch of reasons, internal. We don't want to encrypt, these systems on the network, or we can't, and can we still be compliant? And the short answer is, well, the core control that applies to encryption at rest, or that could apply to encryption at rest, technically just says protect the confidentiality of CUI at rest, right? So it opens the door for trade-offs between some physical and administrative controls and in the technical control, which the go-to technical control around that tends to be encryption. So I think that's a really great example where some of those trade-offs exist, and a lot of the controls, not all of them, but a lot of the controls are worded in such a way to allow some of those trade-offs. And I would say that if you haven't looked at the model appendices or in the assessment guide, they do a pretty good job of outlining where some of those trade-offs live. So if you've only looked at the model document itself, I highly recommend taking a look at the appendices in the assessment guide on that. And the other thing that I guess is worth talking about too, in terms of encryption at rest, is so you can achieve the control by maybe doing some of these physical security solutions for the systems in your data center to protect the confidentiality of systems at rest. But if you have, say, a virtualized infrastructure, right, on the security side of TrustedSec, we see with some level of frequency, right, when you have kind of a VDI stood up, folks can basically steal entire machines and everything on those machines digitally, right? So from a security perspective, right, encryption, might have some benefits over, just the straight physical controls. But from a compliance perspective, if you're not doing encryption, you can typically compensate with the physical controls.
And just to reiterate something you say a lot is they're assuming that you have all the other controls in place when there are those statements made, or when you're looking at all of the other, potential things that you could do instead of, just having encryption.
Yeah, typically, and it's a good thing to keep in mind, right? Because CMMC is pretty much a thumbs up, thumbs down, pass fail type certification. The trade-offs associated with any one individual control are assuming that the risks addressed by all the other controls are good, right? So it's a way that they can kind of justify some of those security trade-offs. So any individual control or trade-off associated with any individual control assumes the rest of those controls are in place.
And so even though you have to have them, there might be, I wouldn't even say additional, but you're just going to have to be very cognizant of the other controls that you have in place, the other validation, et cetera. But as you said, you have to anyway. But for this particular one, you're going to maybe have to go through it depending on how the auditor handles things. So
yeah, and like I said, the current assessment guide and appendices has a good definitions of a lot of those trade-offs. But to your point, the C3 PAOs, the folks that are actually going to be doing the audits and the certification audits, they're undergoing training and getting documentation, all that stuff sort of now, and some of that stuff is still coming live. So I fully expect there to be additional documentation as time goes on around acceptable trade-offs versus unacceptable trade-offs and things like that, right? As the program really gets rolling in terms of certifications.
Okay, great. And I see that we do have some questions. I think we're going to explain some of them as we go. Some of them we're touching on actually in a couple other slides down the road as we group them. So we'll definitely be able to get to all of them. Okay, next question is, how much is enough training? And this was, I thought, a great question from someone. Say we have to have training and we have to train all employees and they have to be up to speed for their roles. Well, how much is enough? How do we know that we're compliant?
Well, so as a general question, whatever amount of training you need to everyone have the knowledge and understanding of the program and what they need to do. But the link here is taking you to a course it's mandatory for all the DoD and industry personnel that are going to have access to CUI, so the controlled unclassified data. So you'll need to go to that link and run through the training. If you work in IT or InfoSec for a while, a lot of the things in there will look familiar, but it also has a lot of information about how certain data is defined and classified, and kind of what the hierarchies are and things like that. I will note they'll tell you right when you go there that they don't keep any record of you having taken that training. So when you get to the end, make sure you print out the little PDF that they create for you. But really, if you're going to be dealing with CUI, then that's the training that you need to take. Kind of regardless of your role in it. There are also a lot of other resources that are accessible. From that page that you can kind of click around and really have a really good time kind of learning about the whole CUI ecosystem and the defense contracting.
Excellent. Sounds great. And could you put that in? Someone has to put that link in the chat, just so they can click on it.
Sure, absolutely.
Thank you. Okay, other discussions, and we just wanted to get to a couple of these since they've come up, and you might not be familiar with them with some of these terms. So Rick, talk us through the Christian Doctrine, the False Claims Act, and the COTS exemption.
Yeah, so the Christian Doctrine is a really interesting thing in U.S. case law precedent stuff. Basically, there was an organization called, I think, Christian and Sons or Christian Brothers. I really should know. I apologize for getting it wrong. But basically what had happened was they worked on defense contracts. The short story is they claimed ignorance because something was omitted from a contract. And the court found that they could still be, penalized essentially, as though the things that should have been in the contract actually were in the contract. So put differently, standard FAR type regulations were missing from the contract, but they're still liable for doing the right federal acquisition regulations stuff. It's a pretty unique case, but it does set precedent suggesting that organizations can be held liable if regulatory requirements are left out of contracts, whether intentionally or unintentionally. So basically the theory is if you play in the government space, it is on you to make sure you're doing the right government stuff. And ignorance is not a defense for not knowing you should have been doing certain things. And CMMC compliance, during sort of the practitioner training that we went through, they noted very specifically the Christian doctrine, and CMMC compliance, falls right in there. So even if it's missing from a contract, you should sort of self-police as much as possible to make sure you're staying out of trouble. The False Claims Act is another sort of legal thing worth mentioning, and this is really about whistleblowers and the fact that whistleblowers can, essentially get a percentage of the actual whistleblower claims when there's financial issues involved. So it's similar, and it's just another point that they sort of drill into us when we're doing these trainings, to make sure that folks take this stuff seriously, because as Alex mentioned before, it's not going anywhere. COTS exemptions, hugely important to understand. This was a thing during NIST 171, so to many people will probably be familiar. But basically, if you have a COTS product, a commercial off-the-shelf product, a thing that you don't only sell or make, you don't only sell to the government or make just for the government, you can very, very, very likely get an exception to CUI stuff, because it's tough for the government to make the argument that if someone can pick something up off the shelf of Walmart or buy it from you directly, and then just reverse engineer the thing, right? Then why would they force these people to go to all these lengths to protect this data in a very specific way? So if you sell commercial off-the-shelf products, there's a very, very high likelihood that that you will be essentially exempted from the CMMC specific stuff. And typically, although I haven't seen this yet, I would anticipate those COTS exemptions to have a home in the standard CMMC contract language when those CMMC applicable RFPs go out. And unsupported and legacy software, as far as that one's concerned, I mean, yeah, there's going to be a lot of that, and essentially isolate it the best you can isolate it, move off it, make sure you have a very strong or layered defenses in terms of protecting those things, which where you might not be able to specifically apply directly a control. And again, really make sure you're looking at those sort of control trade-offs that are defined in the appendices and assessment guidance.
Okay, great. And last slide before we get to the questions, and we have a lot of them. So tell us a little about this. Again, you wrote a blog on it. What's available for small businesses?
Yeah, so a lot of this conversation that we've had with some small organizations started, and a lot of folks have asked, so we did put up a quick blog on it, but it started on the expenses side, right? If you've been sort of following the thread for a lot of this, the DoD has said that CMMC related expenses will be what they call it, allowable costs, and basically that means forgive me for using some shortcut terminology, but basically if you spend money on certain CMMC things, you'll be able to expense it back to the government as part of a contract, more or less, almost like travel expenses. So the thing about that is, although it is technically true, there's a couple kind of gotchas once you start thinking through it. The first and foremost is, if you're an organization that has said you've been self-attesting to NIST 171 for a couple years now, and say you need to be level 3, well, that's only a 20 control uplift from NIST 800-171 to CMMC level 3. So, if you're trying to implement all 130 controls or the majority of those controls, chances are you're not going to be able to expense large chunks of that, because the government's going to say, well, you've been telling us for years that you were NIST 171 compliant. They have also said, though, that costs associated with things like readiness reviews and things like the certification audits and assessments themselves, those could also be allowable costs. But the challenge is with that is, if that increases your pricing beyond a competitor, well, you might lose the bid. So there's some risk there. And the fact of the matter is that you don't get reimbursed for anything if you lose a bid. So, I anticipate that just, based on the nature of how this stuff is going to roll forward, a lot of those costs are just going to end up being assumed by the organizations themselves, even though parts of them are allowable costs. I can also envision certain allowable costs for services or systems that have a subscription-oriented nature to them. If you don't have a logging and alerting thing, or you need an MSP to help monitor your logs 24/7, those sorts of things, you can probably pass some of that cost forward. But again, I think a lot of organizations are going to be pretty judicious with that, because raising your prices is not exactly a feather in your cap when you're battling against other organizations for the business. So that's where a lot of the conversation started, and when we kept looking into it, there are some other ways that you might be able to get assistance, right? SBA grants and awards, if you're not familiar, definitely look at their sites. If you're a manufacturer specifically, work with the MEP Center. Sometimes there's grants and awards there as well. And they all have websites, and you can check out the blog for some quick links to those places. And then other assistance, is not always directly financially related, but sometimes they can help soften some of the cost, right? Your local PTACs and SBOs can help. Sometimes they have programs that will, essentially, they might have additional training to help get folks up to speed internally, or to offset some of the costs of documentation or things that you might have to build yourself. So not so much direct financial assistance, but sometimes you can find some shortcuts, and your mileage may vary based on your specific locality and who you're working with. But I know some of them have some resources in place that they can help with. And the last thing on here from other assistance, just to back up one, is utilizing the Prime system. So this is a bit of a get out of jail free card. I guess the caveat is, if you work with CUI, but you just know you're not going to be able to do the lift, and you have a prime contractor, or you could even engage with a subcontractor that is CMMC compliant, you have to do a little bit of contractual jujitsu in terms of evidencing how you make this work. But it is a fair and an architecture that they trained us on, is that you can theoretically use another organization's systems, as long as within the contract you can sort of talk through how you're going to make sure that the CUI and FCI stays within that other organization's certified systems and doesn't make it to your own system. So if you're a manufacturer and you need technical drawings, that might not be applicable, but if you're more service oriented, you might be able to get away with stuff like that.
Okay, great. I know we're running up against it. We get questions. First quick one, and I'm not sure if you know this, but would support for personnel for compliance management be allowed in the grant?
As an allowable cost, it could be. I think if you can demonstrate that you don't need it for typical business operations, but you do need it for CMMC, then it absolutely could be an allowable cost. In terms of the grants themselves, they tend to be pretty specific. So there may or may not be grants available for that. I'm not entirely sure. And it'll be also specific on the nature of the work you're doing and things like that as well.
Great. All right, two main themes. Number one is around the cloud. One of the questions is, we are embarking on a FedRAMP certification process this year. Does any CMMC certification come along for the ride with this?
Last I heard is that they're still figuring out reciprocity with FedRAMP. Unfortunately, I don't have any additional inside information to that other than they're still figuring out if and or how that will work.
And so then just for general cloud and using cloud systems, any specific gotchas, things to look out for, pros and cons that we're seeing?
I would probably just make sure you're going to your cloud providers or potential cloud providers with the list of requirements and that they're comfortable talking to you about how they satisfy them, right? It's not exactly, it's slightly different than a SOC report in a number of ways, although SOC TSPs can be used to address some of these things. But if your cloud provider is not particularly comfortable talking you through how they can achieve these things, as long as you use a solution in this specific way, that would be a pretty big red flag to me.
So the other theme is around segregation of duties. Can you pass an audit if the same person that is handling the governance, also the person doing all the work, i.e. one IT security person shop, is that type of question?
Yeah, short answer is yes, because you're getting a third party audit around this stuff. Obviously, the more eyes, the better, but I haven't seen anything that suggests that there are, that there are direct issues with that. There might be some indirect hoops you have to jump through in terms of how you evidence certain controls and things like that. But to a large extent, there's nothing that, as far as I know, that would directly prevent you from getting certified, even in a one-person IT shop.
Okay, great. From your experience, how would this compare to a SOC 2 audit in terms of depth and breadth of controls?
Certainly some overlap. I guess that's the best way I can put it. The style of audit is kind of similar, right? You have to get a third party. They're looking at your stuff. They're making sure that you are actually doing what you say you're doing. As far as I know, they're still figuring out things like sample sizes and all that stuff as far as how the assessments themselves will truly look. We know some stuff in terms of what acceptable evidence looks like and things like that. So I would say a fair number of similarities, but obviously the scope of the controls versus the scope of the TSPs is going to be the big thing from a control or operational perspective. And then from a data perspective, there may or may not be overlap between the SOC 2 report and the scoping of where the CUI lives. So there can be differences there too.
And there's probably just worth mentioning that there's kind of a fundamental difference in that if you have CUI, you have CUI, whereas the SOC 2 scope and, which principles you're looking at can be organizationally defined, to some degree. I mean, obviously there's nuance to that. If one of your customers is requiring, you look at a certain process or whatever else it might be. So, keep in mind you have one, that they're very different in that way, in that obviously the CMMC is very prescriptive over what it covers, where the SOC 2 can be obviously have more user definition there.
Right, absolutely.
Great, just a couple more. Again, another kind of group is about the primes. How do you find out when your prime has to be compliant? Is there a list? How does a company know what level compliance they need to achieve if they haven't been told yet or haven't had contracts of this sort? Would it be defined in the contracts, criteria, etc.?
Yeah, so I'll answer it, but if you haven't looked yet, go to the CMMC site and take a look at their FAQ on the site specifically. It'll talk to you specifically about where in the contracts it is specified. So the short answer is, if something requires CMMC, it will be specified in the contract. I believe the list of prime contracts requiring it for 2021 has been defined, and some of those audits are I think starting or will be starting shortly. But it's definitely going to be defined in the contract, and the level will also be defined in the contract. And I might have missed a question there, but I think those are the core answers there.
Okay, great. Right, and I think that it'll be up on the site. A couple other questions just on FIPS and DFARS. When will DFARS review end? And where you can maybe find some better information. What about equipment that's not found in a FIPS regulated list? Some of those types of things. Is it better to go to the source for those things, or where would be or another one on the risk management framework, and how the anticipated workflow is going to handle those things? Where would be the best place to get some of those types of answers, or can you answer them, fairly?
I mean, some of them I know, but typically, the CMMC should be able to answer some of these things. I know some of it's still being defined. From an RMF perspective, I would use 837 at a high level, since it's all sort of NIST driven, although I haven't seen anything specifically that says how exceptions will be handled yet. From a FIPS perspective, I'm seeing some of these questions, so I'm just reading as I go.
Yeah.
Implementation, tails of questions about FIPS and segmentation. We probably could do something on segmentation. I don't know. We'll have to talk about it to see, but I think it's a broad topic and there's a lot of questions on it.
Yeah, we did a segmentation webinar, but maybe that's a good idea from whoever posted this. Maybe we can redo it once the guidance comes out, and with some of the technical folks as well, to get into some of the nitty gritty. Yeah,
once they refresh the guidance for sure. And then if some equipment clients are not found in the regulated list, you have to purchase new equipment to be level 3 qualified. If we're talking about CMMC certification, I don't believe so. But I would have to cross-check to be 100% sure. But I don't believe so, because typically you do have in many cases some trade-off type controls where you'd be able to sort of wrap those systems in many cases in such a way that they're not at risk for other things, and still be compliant with all the level 3 items. It would depend a little bit on each specific situation, but typically I would think the answer is no, you wouldn't have to purchase all new equipment, unless your upstream and downstream stuff is also, kind of so aged it can't handle the compensating controls that they define.
All right. Well, I know we went a few minutes over. Thanks everyone for sticking on with us, and thank you, Rick and Alex, for all the information. Certainly anyone that would like to reach out to us, have very specific questions in there. As you always say, at TrustedSec, we're always happy to go over and answer those things. We have so many different experts within the organization, technical, compliance, etc., that we're always happy to jump in and answer those questions for you. So feel free to shoot them along. And once again, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you again, Alex and Rick.
Yeah, thank you. Take care, all.
Take care. Thanks.